All right, sounds good. Okay, great. Well, it's really amazing to be here today. I'm excited to be at the Space Education Summit, presenting on space urban planning, which is a favorite topic of mine. So today I'm going to be looking at infrastructure for sustained human settlement on the lunar and Martian surfaces, and why it's so important that we have a planning approach to what we plan to do in space in the future. Oh, is that not working? There we go. So I know a lot of you already that are here, so good to see you again. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Britt. I'm a space urban planner, also founder and CEO of Celestial Citizen. I host the Celestial Citizen and Continuum podcasts, where we discuss on Celestial Citizen all of the social, cultural, and sort of governance aspects of living off Earth, as well as some of the technological concerns and issues that we have ahead as well. And then Continuum is our space news brand, where we try to make everything that's going on in the space industry very accessible and digestible for everyday people just curious to learn more. My background is in architecture and urban planning, most heavily on the urban planning side. And then I also have a master's in space resources as well. So I've, for a long time, been very interested in not only sort of the design and human factors approach to how we'll someday live off Earth, but also thinking about it from the perspective of kind of a macro level plan and how we manage our resources and how we do this in a really sustainable way. So before I jump into my full presentation here, I think the opening thought that I wanted to start with is really around this idea of, sort of considering humanity's future in space. We need to be thinking really hard today about the deep importance of that shared cultural heritage in the cosmos as well. And I think that working towards a future in which we are able to promote peaceful coexistence and cooperation off Earth and on Earth is going to be really critical for any sort of success that we might find in space. So I just kind of want to frame the whole conversation from that perspective to start. So the next question is, really, how do we support and encourage a positive and sustainable space future? The answer to that question, at least in my opinion, is space urban planning. So urban planning has a very long terrestrial history, both good and bad, to be honest, but it has been useful in terms of, setting out a vision and a plan for what some of our Earth cities have looked like and how they function. And it can, when used appropriately, be a really good tool for community building, bringing together different stakeholders and making sure that what we're working towards is a vision that a lot of individuals and organizations and stakeholders feel connected to, and it really resonates with them. And ultimately, having more people, more or less buy into that future is really going to be what determines its success. So since this is a conversation about space, or this conference is focused on space, I thought it might be helpful to start with just a quick, sort of background on what exactly is urban planning, right? Because this isn't a topic that we necessarily discuss in the space industry a ton. So I really like the definition by Susan Feinstein at Harvard, where she talks about how, the design and regulation of the uses of space is, of course, a component of urban planning, focusing on the physical form, the economic functions, as well as the social impacts of the urban environment. These are all key features of urban planning. And as a field, it really draws upon engineering, architectural, professionals, as well as those focused on social and political aspects. So it really does have a nice blend of being both technical and qualitative, and grounded in a lot of different focus areas. So really, I think urban planners are helpful, especially for the space industry, in that they can help bring together a lot of folks from very diverse backgrounds that all might have a lot of interesting ideas to bring to the table. But urban planning will allow for those ideas to be, sort of very seamlessly interwoven, or that would be the hope anyway. And I also like the definition that Professor Carlo Ratti at MIT writes about in one of his recent books, where he said, planning decisions we make today determine the scope of choices we will have tomorrow. And that really resonates with me as we think about the future of living in space someday, because of course, I think the most important thing that we can do is to not rob future generations of opportunities or of a way of life that is very high quality. So I think ultimately we need to think about all of that decision making that we're doing today as preserving and keeping open optionality for the future. So how can urban planning be useful to the space industry? So I think there's a number of ways, and really these are just a few that I think jumped out at me at first, but really planning for broader public participation. Just even with the recent SpaceX Starship launch yesterday, I think a lot of us saw that there was real disconnect, even just in terms of whether the mission was successful or unsuccessful, or exactly what it meant. So I think that the more that we try to bring the public into these conversations, the better off we'll all be about starting to get on the same page. Now, that doesn't mean we're all going to agree, of course. And in fact, there will be a lot of disagreement in planning out some of these space futures. But I think it's important to at least be starting from that initial framework of sort of broad public interest. And so part of that is we really, and I'm very happy to say that, since we launched Celestial Citizen and in the years even prior to that, right, like we've been spending a lot of time on trying to reach a broader and broader audience. And we've, in our own small way, found a lot of success with that. But there have been so many amazing companies that predate Celestial Citizen and that have, come along here in the last few years as well, that have been focusing specifically on democratizing access to space science and research. And I think that's one of the most critical things that we can do right now is to make this conversation more inclusive so that we can get more ideas brought to the table. And so, another key part of that is going to be encouraging greater inclusion and diversity in STEM and related fields. And planning can definitely help with that. Planning can definitely help with the public engagement and the community outreach. Because ultimately what we want to do is we want to facilitate a discussion with the global community here on Earth about what this future in space looks like. And we want to empower people regardless of their academic background, their careers, what have you, their social status, their economic status. We want to have people feel empowered to participate in this and that they see themselves really in what these potential space futures could be. So another perhaps more practical application as well could be guiding the planning process for future spaceports on Earth as well, and mediating opposing interests as needed. This is a topic and an area that we've already seen to really ruffle a lot of feathers with communities and things like that. And I think that we can't just sort of hand wave that problem away. I think that we really need to get at the heart of those disagreements and work to try to find resolutions where possible. So I think taking a more thoughtful approach to how we go about developing spaceports and integrating the communities in which they will be into those conversations as well, so that people are not really people don't feel like they're being left out of that process. It's going to be very important. And then, of course, both on Earth, like in the case of spaceports, but then off Earth someday as well, we really need to start planning and designing for both the physical infrastructure as well as those intangible institutions of space communities. So governance models and also starting to think about like all the things that make a city function, right? So concerns over not only sort of the governance, but also just where is power going to be coming from, or a lot of these other sort of just technical things that we need to figure out. How are we going to make sure that there is a certain level of human health and safety? How do we regulate for different things? Are we going to have zoning in space or are we not, right? There's a very complicated history with zoning, at least here in the US, to be sure. So there's really got to be a lot of things that we start to figure out. Some people will say that we're too early to start that process, but I disagree. I think that actually now is the best possible time to start really planning these things out and having these conversations. Because once we get going and once we start landing machinery and eventually humans, it's honestly going to be a little late, and we're going to find that some of those very first decisions that we make, we're locked into in a way that is even more strict perhaps than on Earth, where we have limited ability to correct for mistakes, but there is still some ability. So there's a lot of overlap between these two slides, but I think the important point here is just to focus on the key aspects of space urban planning. So, right, maintaining continued channels of democratic participation, high levels of civic engagement. So that's really focused on the public engagement piece that I think we could be doing better from a governmental level as well as the private sector, right? I think both of those groups could be doing a better job in those areas. Facilitating transdisciplinary discussion and cross-industry collaboration. So I think by bringing in more urban planners into the space industry, we'll be able to more successfully see those connections and linkages to other industries. I mean, an obvious one, right, is the climate sector and trying to figure out how what we're doing in space not only benefits back to Earth as well, but also what sustainable practices or new technologies or sensors or things like that can we integrate into future planning on the lunar surface or eventually the Martian surface as well. We'll also want to establish a participatory framework. Again, that's really all about empowerment, having humans feel like they are truly citizens in this future, providing equitable access to balanced information and digestible facts. This was a big source of inspiration for why we started our Continuum newsletter, because we wanted to just be an independent source of information for people. We wanted to find fun and interesting and entertaining ways to inform our community that we were building at Celestial Citizen. Another thing is, and this one takes, it's really an art, but balancing those different stakeholder interests, also doing a lot of stakeholder analysis to understand where people are coming from and, sort of what their expectations might look like for a planning process for a future space community, and then encouraging a lot of open dialogue between all of these different parties. And then most importantly, I would say, and that's why I'll end on this one, is integrating ideas and feedback into actionable urban and institutional design. So, right, even before we can start designing the process, or, oftentimes people will say, okay, well, what would the ideal city design look like? Well, that really depends on the feedback that you get from people along the way. So this is going to be super critical that we start creating that feedback loop into everything that we do in space, whether it's from a design of what the built environment looks like, whether it's design of policies or governance, or whether it's even design of what sort of a future cultural identity might look like on the moon, right? All of these things are going to be really important, and we have to build them as we go. So the one big takeaway that I want people to understand about space urban planning is not that it is necessarily city design, right? City design is in many ways, I think, a component of architecture, critically important. We're going to definitely be doing a lot of that in this process. But space urban planning is actually an even broader approach to it, right? So it's the process behind it. It's the approach and methodology that helps get us to the design. So I think that that's maybe one of the big take-home messages I wanted to share today. So with that all being said, if we look at public participation, a great scholar in this area, James Crichton, talked about sort of the process by which the public concerns, needs, and values are incorporated into governmental and corporate decision-making. I don't see any reason why we couldn't be doing more of this for the space industry. And some of the benefits of really integrating that public participation in a meaningful way is that whatever the project or the plan or the outcome is, right, it's going to have more political legitimacy because the public was brought along with us. It's also going to really help with consensus building and community building. For those of you that are mostly focused on maybe the economic concerns or the business components of this, it's going to really minimize cost overruns and delays because of the fact that we're not having so much opposition along the way if we're being respectful and listening to people as we go, right? Not everybody is going to get their way 100% of the time, but if we give and take and we kind of do this process in a way that's very thoughtful, I do think we'll be able to minimize, sort of any delays or major opposition to what we're doing, as well as just making mistakes of design. So inefficiencies that would be built into a system, right? That can be very costly. And the cost of undoing anything in space, I imagine, would be astronomical, no pun intended. So that's something to consider. But also, public participation can help improve the quality of decision making. So we'll have more ideas, more innovation, and just more, kind of brains solving these problems. And it can oftentimes create a non-adversarial environment and a civil society. So I think space urban planning really has to work to strengthen that connection between people and place. And that's going to be really important. And I think we can start by doing that here terrestrially, by being really thoughtful about the ways in which the space industry starts to interact with communities Earthside. And what I mean by that is, again, going back to that example I had earlier about spaceports, about where we are locating offices and where we're having, employees of the space workforce live. How are we thinking about how they are interacting with the communities in which they find themselves? And can we be doing a better job to be good stewards of this planet, but also good stewards of the space industry, and making sure that we are presenting to the broader public in the best possible way that, we're not just here to, do whatever it is we want to do in space and, sort of forget about Earth, forget about, the communities that are there. So that's something we could be doing a better job of, to be sure. And I think the other thing too that I'll just point out here is that some folks might be familiar with Eleanor Ostrom's work, which, of course, is looking at the commons and thinking about it from that space from, of course, Eleanor Ostrom was not necessarily thinking about space, but extrapolating her work here. If we think about space as a commons, right, could we look to sort of, manage public infrastructure and networks through these citizen networks that Ostrom talked about in her work? And what would that look like if, we all sort of felt that we had an equal share in caring for and maintaining the sustainability of our physical surroundings in space? I think that could be a really interesting model. Now, some of the challenges to public participation are, the fact that participation looks really different to different people, right? So some people might look at participation and say that they're willing to give up, 6 hours on a Saturday to sit in the design charrette and talk through all of these things with, folks at NASA and folks from other private space companies and share their ideas. For other people, it might be taking a survey. It might be sending a letter, an email. We have to be willing to kind of meet people where they are. The other thing that's going to be really challenging is, of course, scaling this effort. And because ultimately, whatever we do in space, I believe, should be a global effort. We really need to make sure that this isn't just US centric, that we are scaling the effort in a way that is very international as well. Also, we're going to have to work against the fact that, we live in pretty divided times right now. And a lot of the messages about space that are out there can be very polarizing. So that's certainly something that we'll have to, work. It's a bit of an uphill battle, I think, there, but certainly not one that we can't tackle. There's also a lot of design bias of tools and process. So I think being aware of that, and this could even be just bias of questions and surveys, or the way that we pull data, or the way that we think about creating a learning set for something that we want to analyze, right? These are all different areas that we should be aware of, and how those might impact the information that we're getting back. And then I think you also have to think about how do you engage people that typically are not engaged in this process of planning space and of thinking about space. People who don't feel like they could ever see themselves having a role in space, right? How do we change that? How do we make people feel like they are a part of this, this community? So I think these are all some of the things that we'll have to really work towards in the coming years. And then some of the implementation behind this, I think, is building out a network of citizens, right? So at Celestial Citizen, we really worked hard to build a community. We are now over 100,000 strong, which, we're really proud of, but it's not enough, to be honest. So we need to be reaching a lot more of the public. We need to be building out a network of experts that can also help us in terms, and these could be people with urban planning backgrounds, it could be people with different backgrounds in the space industry. It should be a wide variety of folks, but really starting to build out that network so that we can plan for community events and strategies of how we start to really engage people and create discussion on these topics. And then, in order to sort of support that, that global network, we need to have national points of contact as well. I won't go into all the details here because I don't want to run out of time, but I will say that, it's very important to have a multi-channel approach in the way that you're approaching urban planning. So in other words, virtual town halls, collaborative design, virtual debate, ethical use of data, polling, game theory, right? These are all ways in which we can, again, meet people where they are and try to engage the largest number of folks in meaningful ways. So we really need to be thinking about how we're sharing data, making sure that it is transparent and accurate. How are we disseminating information, right? Or is it through fact sheets? Is it through public briefs and reports? Is it through informal methods, more like newsletters or things like that? How do we reach more people? Because some of the methods that we've used historically, perhaps actually not as useful in terms of reaching the broader public, right? I mean, NASA puts out a tremendous amount of interesting reports, but, for people that aren't already interested in space, are they going to sit down, with a 50-page PDF and go through it? Probably not. But could we distill that information in other ways that people will then be, more interested or, less intimidated by it, perhaps? That's I think an interesting area. And of course, looking at thin participation methods and thick participation methods. And what I mean by that is, thin would be surveys, polls, social media, things that are just a little bit easier, take a little less time. Thick participation methods are bigger commitments, right? So I would love to see Celestial Citizen partner with some other groups in the space industry to create design or planning workshops around, helping vision out what this first space community might look like, or one of the first space communities. There's likely to be many. So, these are things that take more time, take more planning, but can be tremendously fruitful if done right. And then, of course, again, it's the representation. So can we work with space activists and community leaders and people that can really help engage people? And what this boils down to in a lot of ways is citizen power, or celestial citizen power, if you will, but really encouraging people everywhere to see themselves as celestial citizens, as part of this, this broader idea, right? Where people are not necessarily so focused on their local identity or their national identity, but they see themselves as a citizen of the cosmos, and really encouraging the space industry to support the mission that all people deserve to be deliberately included in the future. So we need space leadership to make that message abundantly clear that we want everybody to be deliberately included. And it's that deliberately part that is most important there. So getting into a little bit of the design piece of urban planning, right? Like, this is something that is a super interesting topic. Of course, I'm biased, but when we start to think about, how we're going to plan for this first city, this first community in space, there's a lot to consider, obviously. And what I just outlined before here was all of the planning and the public engagement that kind of goes into that initial step of thinking about things. And then there's going to be a really important piece of it that hopefully is happening all along the way, where experts, whether they be space architects, whether they be infrastructure experts, other, aspects of the space industry, other professionals that will come in and say, okay, well, this is the reality of what we think we can do today, right? So these are our limitations. In terms of where we think we'll be able to land, what we think we'll be able to build initially, and what are our power constraints and things like that. So we'll need to consider all of that. But it's never too early to start thinking about what that broader vision looks like of how you start a community and how it grows, right? Because it's that expansion part of it that's really tricky, right? We don't want to have a sprawl situation. We don't want to have like Los Angeles on the moon. So we want to try to avoid something where we're sort of haphazardly developing as we go, or even making mistakes in terms of the way that we might approach the design, right? So there's a possibility that we have a plan that we've put together, but maybe we've forgotten to include some, very important assumptions or other data that could drive that decision making. And then lo and behold, we realize, oh, okay, actually, this is a very inefficient design. This doesn't work, and it's not easy to expand. So how do we basically make it so that we blend, both a rigorously planned community with also allowing for organic growth and flexibility along the way? On this slide here, you'll see these, I love these little grid images of different cities, right? Because I think that they tell a whole story in and of themselves. The reason why I put up some of these here is because I wanted to ask the question, how do the spaces that we either intentionally or unintentionally create influence the way that we live and work? So as you're sitting there, I want everyone to kind of look at these, and maybe you've been to some of these cities, maybe you haven't, but if you have, look at the pattern and think about what the physical experience was when you were standing, walking down the street, in one of these cities, right? What did that feel like? Did you enjoy that urban experience? Was it overwhelming? Was it confusing? What was frustrating about that? Or what was really amazing? And what did you love about it? So I think all of these things are really important as we consider and start to think from like a bird's eye view, what a future space community could look like, is really thinking about the implications of how it will start to expand and what that design will look like. And so on that same vein, I wanted to bring up, I always chuckle because these two images could not be more opposite here. So of course, at the top, we're looking at Barcelona, very rigorously planned, right? And I'm not saying that that's necessarily even the desired outcome in space, but it is certainly one model to look at and consider. And then at the bottom, you have McMurdo Station in Antarctica. And I'm not sure, I'd love to hear from anybody in, when we wrap here for the Q&A, but if that bottom image inspires anybody or makes them feel really excited about visiting, what I will say is that to me, it looks sort of just like a hodgepodge of buildings that were, very, sort of haphazardly put in place. And there's also not a real clear, there's no clear vistas or sightlines or even ways in which, I could clearly say, oh, yes, okay, that's where it's going to expand, or that's how that's going to go. So I think even if we wind up somewhere in the middle of those two images, right, it's very important to start thinking about that planning now, because it's really going to influence our ability to live and work and function efficiently in space. Just in 2021, we put 14.5 billion into the space industry, right? Where we were looking to build out transportation and infrastructure logistics, which obviously makes sense as a first leg here, but we really haven't spent as much time focused or directed on what we do once we get there. And so I hope to see in future years that we really start to direct a lot more attention and energy to that piece of the puzzle as well. Because ultimately, I believe that an unstable ecology risks disaster for the space economy. So that's something we'll really need to start focusing on sooner rather than later. And just to sort of summarize here what I've talked about today, really the question of why space urban planning, right? It's not something that immediately comes to mind for people when they're thinking about the space industry and sort of priorities. But I really want to stress that it should be a priority, because ultimately, if we really want to have a sustainable way of life, if we want to have sustainable infrastructure for future living on the moon and on Mars, we need a plan. And we need a really thoughtful approach. And so the key features, in my opinion, of space urban planning would be public participation, innovative policymaking, cross-industry initiatives, systems thinking, tech integration, community-driven visioning, very important, the community-driven part of that, consensus building, and development of norms. Once we have those things in place or started, we can really start to design something very interesting. But I think it's important that we shift away from this model of saying, oh, okay, we're gonna hire, X architecture firm to design this concept for us, right? Because then what are we getting? 4 or 5 people maybe that are heads down on that problem. What I'm proposing here is that we have a collective vision that informs the design, which is a completely different approach to it. And obviously, if you can tell already, I'm pretty passionate about it. But I hope that this conversation today at least sort of kickstarts that way of thinking, that the most successful design, the most sustainable design for a future space community is going to be one where we put the legwork in first and have it be this collective vision versus a very narrow focus from a select few. And if you're interested in getting in touch with me, I'd love to hear from you. So you can email me, britt@celestialcitizen.com, or reach out to me on LinkedIn, Twitter, or Instagram. I'm definitely happy to chat. And I will stop there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Britt. That was a really interesting talk. You touched on a lot of really important points, and a lot was happening in the chat as well. So we have some questions for you already.
Great.
The first, I think people are looking for some resources that they can look into space urban planning. Do you have any academic sources, peer-reviewed articles, anything that might help them kind of get started?
Yeah, so I have some, so honestly, it's a pretty nascent field. I don't know, you never know, because I always think there's never any novel ideas, but I will say that I am not aware of anyone else that is doing space urban planning. I would like to make this more of an academic field. It's, as it stands today, there's not a lot of documentation on it. There's a lot, of course, on urban planning. There is like a little bit about like kind of a broader base planning in a space architecture book that was written by Brent Sherwood. And there are some blog posts. If you go to Celestial Citizen on Medium, there's also our blog posts on space urban planning, which link to some sources there that you could check out. And I can drop that in the chat here. But yeah, sadly, there's not a lot. I hope to change that.
Sounds like you're the right person to get that started. I know there's a lot of also space architecture is a relatively new field. Like you see a lot more coming up, but it would be good to see more urban planning incorporated into that. And then we had another question about green. So what about green? Can we grow plants in space for food? What about animals and trees? How important is the green ecosystem for our lives?
It's interesting. On Celestial Citizen podcast, I had a conversation with a space architect about greenhouse design specifically. And I mean, look, I'm not a greenhouse designer and I'm not going to claim to be, which is why I would direct you to that conversation instead with somebody who has spent a lot of time researching it. But a couple of the interesting things that came up in that conversation was around the fact that as we think about even just like the design of greenhouses in space, we need to think about the cultural considerations as well, right? So different, different ethnic groups might have different preferences for certain, vegetables or plants or things like that, or even herbs. So it's like, starting to balance, how that looks. And of course, any greenhouse designer, Interstellar Lab comes to mind as a company that's focusing on this as well. But anytime you're looking at that, right, or a closed loop or semi-closed loop system, you're really having to think about the efficiency of all of the different things that are involved. So there's a real science to what gets selected to be grown in those greenhouses. But I do think from a design perspective, right? So just going back to kind of the urban planner architect hat for a moment, I do think that having integration of green space, however small, is going to be critical, I think, to our sort of like human health and mental wellness, because it's something that you've seen historically, right? Like even in New York City, right? They create, and I mean, there was a lot of it's probably a longer conversation than we have time for today. There's a lot of politics behind how Central Park got created, but the idea behind it was that it basically was going to be the lungs of the city, right? It was going to create this breathing space, and I think it's obviously going to be different in space, right? But I actually think that if it is technically feasible and possible, having some sort of or multiple shared community spaces that also act as greenhouses or places where we can grow things is going to be critical. I think it'll also be a very popular place for people to hang out because of that connection to something that's alive and growing. So I think there's a lot of possibilities, and I certainly think it'll be very important in the way that we design.
Yeah, definitely. And I think your point also about, how culture plays into what we decide to grow. You see a lot of talk about permaculture, and when people are talking about agriculture these days, and a lot of it really just stems back to indigenous teaching. So that, when you talk about participatory processes, I feel like that's a really important point, is that there are people living on Earth in a very sustainable way, and they have been for a long time. We just need to find a way to include them in this conversation.
It's interesting that you bring that up too, because actually, so when I was a couple of years ago at USC, I was doing some research into just that actually. So like looking at how, like how did indigenous communities in history and then still today, how do they kind of go about public participation and even like restorative justice, which I think is interesting. And so not to plug the podcast again, but I had a really good conversation with Dawn Marsden, and I think that was on season 2 of the podcast, 2 or 3. And so anyway, but that was really interesting in talking about, Dawn wrote a book about, sort of like how we can use indigenous knowledge for like if we were to take sort of a interstellar voyage or something, or 100-year starship kind of approach, like what would that community look like? And we talked about how, okay, but like even just applying that to maybe the lunar surface or something like that. So that was a really interesting conversation, particularly because I think in space, like didn't really talk about it in this presentation, but right, policing. This is a huge problem for us on Earth, like a huge problem. And so how are we actually going to handle disputes or potentially crime in space? Like, how are we going to handle that? And what does restorative justice look like? I mean, I personally think we're going to have to come up with a model that is either based on, how indigenous communities operate, or we're going to have to find some way to sort of combine that with some other approaches, but it's going to look totally different, in my opinion, than what most of us are used to. I think that's a good thing. I think it's an exciting opportunity for us as we start to think about these communities in space. We kind of have an opportunity, if we approach it the right way, to learn, hopefully, from the mistakes that we've made here on Earth and not make those same mistakes going forward.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's easy for people in the space industry to say, this is a blank slate and we're starting over. But we have to be conscious of that and not, carry forward all of these the issues that we have on Earth. I think they touched on that also in the astronaut panel this morning, that it's the responsibility of people who go to space to think about what are we actually bringing with us. So no, that sounds super interesting. I'm definitely going to check out the podcast with Dawn as well. We had another question about analogs. So are there any organizations, that are paying attention to urban planning concepts and how they develop analog bases?
Well, okay, so this is a very interesting topic. So so I'm actually going to be at the Analog Astronaut Conference here in, gosh, just a couple weeks. But anyway, and so one of the things that we are actually looking to do and we'll be announcing is that Celestial Citizen is actually, we're hoping to either create or co-create with partners an analog station that is going to be, hopefully founded in a lot of these values and ideas, but also testing out different ideas for design, as well as integration of sensors, right? So thinking about how can we take some of that sensor technology that we use in smart cities and then kind of like, distill that down to a really, micro example, but in analog stations. So yeah, if anybody out there is interested in partnering with us or wants to talk about that, please reach out, because we would like to extend some of these ideas that we've been, kind of talking about and developing at Celestial Citizen and trying to apply them to an analog.
That's really cool that you mentioned that, actually, because I'm working on an analog facility in Jordan, and that's one of our main research areas is like smart city infrastructure. And I think you touched on it during your presentation as well, that like the things that we develop for space and for Earth, where it's sustainable, can be applied the other way around. So that's our focus, really, is bridging space technologies with sustainable development. I see Hope sent a link to our page
Nice.
in the
Yeah,
chat.
I'd love
Thank
to
you,
see
Hope.
if we could be helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because I do feel that also, with when you were talking about having people participate who wouldn't typically be involved in these projects, I think it also starts with analog research on Earth, right? Because a lot of these analogs are built in places where the people who live there are not consulted or involved in any way. So I think it's really important to kind of change that approach.
Absolutely.
And then we also had an interesting discussion in the chat from someone who said that their friend is involved in urban planning, and they see that, cities have become dysfunctional, and the people who are making the decisions, essentially the elected officials, will predetermine the outcome of these public processes. So when you're saying you're going to participate in something, they basically say, I hear what you're saying, but then they just move on and they do what they want to do originally. And so how would you respond to this? Like, some people said they don't want to be using digital platforms or like virtual meetings. So how can we, accommodate that?
So I think it's kind of like a two-part answer there. One, I mean, I love urban planning, but I will also be its biggest critic, because there has been, not only historically, still today, a lot of problems. I mean, right, like urban planning has a very racist history in the US. And then even, as we kind of think about the institutions that we've put in place, right? There have been so many different issues and things that have popped up that in some cases, right, you could say, when it comes to the design or the layout of cities, right? Like, well, maybe we just didn't anticipate what the future would look like. And that is possible. But then in other cases, there's been like outright bad actors that have really created a lot of these embedded problems that we now find today. So it's a very valid point. And I don't have a great answer for that piece of it, because of course, you want people that would be involved or helping to lead the process to be good actors, hopefully not corrupt. You would hope that whoever the, as I call them, the national points of contact, but, maybe here in Earth cities, the local officials and things like that, you would want them to be acting in the best interest of the citizens, right? So I think the more, and I kind of touched on this a bit, but I think the more that we empower citizens in meaningful ways to actually have a more active role, like right now, we have a very, sort of like trickle down political system in the US, at least, like just speaking from my own experience here. But so, I think in space, we could potentially really turn that around. We could find ways to empower citizens more in the way that we pursue, sort of maybe more of like a decentralized model or something like that, which could be interesting. And, again, I don't have really any of the answers yet on that, but I think it's worth exploring. And then, the other part of that around the apps, I think that's actually like a different, very important conversation. And that kind of goes back to what I was talking about with the multi-channel approach, is that you have to meet people where they are, because some people will not want to get on an app. Some people will not want to do things virtually or anything like that, but they would be more than willing to, drive up to an in-person meeting and sit there for a few hours and talk with a group. You just don't know, right? So you have to try a lot of different methods in terms of how you go about collecting that public participation. And then one of my mentors and professors, when I was in school, she always said that the absolute worst thing that you can do is get a bunch of feedback from people, collect that, and then do nothing with it, right? Because then people feel like I wasted all this time, they didn't do anything with it, they didn't hear me. So we need to, and again, this is all about planning and having that process in place, right? And making sure that you have the team, the network, the tools that you need to do it. But being able to say, we heard you, we're going to integrate what you said into our analysis, and we're going to make sure that it is acknowledged. Now, you also have to communicate to the public that it may not always still go in their favor. That depends, right, on the situation, but having that balanced approach and making sure people feel heard is going to be really critical.
Yeah, I think it's like you said, it's a difficult question and there's no really right or wrong answer. But I like your point about, don't gather feedback if you're not planning on doing something with it, because that's even worse than, not asking people for feedback. And kind of related in terms of collaboration, we have a question about collaboration coordination for like lunar bases, for example, between the US and China. How do we ensure common public goods like basic infrastructure for everyone?
Wow, you all came with the tough questions today, I will say that. That is a big question. That's a really big question. And I think that there are hopefully, I think, a lot of people working on that. Although I will also say I'm a little bit concerned about how many people have given up on that idea of collaboration as well. This is a tricky one, to be sure. Look, I think the big thing is that, like, ultimately, I look back to like the Outer Space Treaty, and to me, that looking back, I'm like, that seems like very unlikely that that document would have had the support that it did. So I'm encouraged by that example of people who were, adversaries in some ways, geopolitically, to come together. Ultimately, we have to find a way that, it's in everybody's best interest, right, to cooperate, to play nice, in everybody's best interest to kind of like have this common infrastructure, as you said it. I don't have a great answer for that. I think it's going to be incredibly hard. I think we just need to continue to try to push for dialogue that is not necessarily so aggressive, right? I mean, it's like I said, I'm getting a little bit concerned. It feels like more and more, we're just people, when you talk to people, they in the space industry, they seem to be, well, it's just never going to happen. So, we're US aligned countries are going to go do this. And then, China aligned countries are going to go do this. if we kind of just give up, I mean, I think we're going to operate in silos, unfortunately. And that's honestly, that's a very dangerous thing on the moon. It's very dangerous to not be collaborating. It's in everybody's best interest for a sustainable future to collaborate. So I hope that the narrative around that starts to change, and I hope we start to make some headway there. But I'm not gonna lie, it's concerning to me at this point.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's unfortunate too for, for countries that don't have an advanced space program. Like we're trying to build something in Jordan now, and it's like you have to align yourself geopolitically with
Yes.
one or the other, when obviously we would all benefit from working together. And it seems like such a simple thing, but it's just not the case.
So I feel like this is my go-to line, like, check out the podcast. So I had an interesting conversation with Chris Van Eyck about that exact topic of like the Artemis Accords and how they are actually starting to sort of force a lot of other countries to kind of pick or choose sides. And ideally, right, like we wouldn't have sides. And so, I think that is a really unfortunate thing. So it's interesting to hear you say that, that's also, been your experience. So, I mean, yeah, I'm concerned that there's a lot of picking and choosing of sides right now. And I'm not really sure how we work out of that. It's, if I had that answer, it would be a great day, but I don't have it. And I suspect it's going to take a consortium of folks to figure that out.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's one of the goals of the human space program, right? Like Frank's vision for what this would be is that we're all exploring together as humanity, which sounds like it's an idealistic view given, geopolitical situations. But I do hope, I haven't completely given up hope on the fact that we will reach that stage eventually.
Yeah. Don't give up hope. I believe we'll get there, but it's going to take some doing. We're going to have to figure some things out for sure.
And so we had a more technical question. So what's going to produce our oxygen when we're living in space?
Yeah, I mean, so this is, I think, one of the interesting things that we're going to have to figure out. And again, I mean, right. So asking an urban planner and architect, I do have a space resources background as well, but I don't claim to really be knee deep in the technical aspects of in situ resource utilization. So I will say that, though, broadly, what I think we're going to really have to do is figure out how to balance. In my personal view, I think there's probably not a clear way to go and live in space in any sort of, long-term fashion, unless we're finding ways to utilize the resources on those celestial bodies. Now, that's kind of, frankly, a controversial statement, because I know there are a lot of people, and their, preference would be that we don't actually disrupt or do, anything to those celestial bodies. And I have a lot of respect for that viewpoint as well. But I will say that I think we ultimately will likely need to figure out, and there are people, especially at Open Lunar Foundation, comes to mind, that are really focused on starting to think about how do we track for transparency, sort of like a registry of activity, as well as manage lunar resources and things like that as well, or eventually, Martian resources. So I think ultimately we will need to figure out, okay, how much are we going to need? How do we manage the resources? They're obviously finite. However, people might say, oh, well, they're infinite in space. Well, it's not really technically true, because they're not all equally accessible. So actually, I'm pretty interested in also kind of balancing the dynamics of, trying not to have a first come first serve situation with resources in space. So that's a great question, and I think that deserves a lot more technical research. So probably an unfulfilling answer there, but that's the best I've got right now.
No, it's fair enough. I think there's a lot of different aspects that play into this. I mean, beyond just the technical side, like you mentioned, is it, first come, first serve, this kind of mentality that, we get to the moon first, we get to the South Pole, we can claim that land, which actually goes against the Outer Space Treaty. But countries are finding some loopholes around it. So I think it'll be interesting to see that play out, especially now with commercial companies trying to do ISRU. I like the idea, though. There's some research into bioregenerative systems. So in addition to the ISRU that you're extracting from the moon or Mars, finding ways to mimic essentially biological systems that we have here on Earth. Sounds like a really cool way to get around that issue.
Yeah. Well, and I think that that's a big part of this is going to be, in that stakeholder analysis, right, that an urban planner would do. It's also figuring out not only just who has like a vested interest or who wants to be involved in the process. It's also figuring out who are the people who can actually help get us there, right? So are there companies, are there organizations, are there researchers, are there, what have you, that are able to bring those skill sets or, have innovative solutions to some of these problems? And how do we basically bring them into these conversations so that we have the expert in the room, right? Or multiple experts, hopefully, multiple experts on the topic of like that particular aspect of, oxygen production, right? And how then they can be in the same room talking to people who, might have more of the architecture and the design aspect. And then we'll have members of the public and we'll have policy makers. And, hopefully this is an international group. And it's like, that's what we need. We need to have all of those kinds of people. And I will say the space industry does a fantastic job. This is a great example of having conferences, virtual things like where we have these conversations. But what I'm talking about is a tiny bit different, right? Because ultimately what you need to do is you need to have, some people who have that kind of like urban planning background that can go ahead and start to do the analysis beforehand of how do we get, enough different skill sets into the room and enough different people that can go back to their governments or go back to their companies. And then how do we also bring in, a cross section of the public, right? So it's thinking about how you balance all those different interests, but still not have an overwhelmingly large event or virtual thing that then, nothing gets decided, nothing gets figured out. There is a strategy and a bit of a, an art to that. And so I think that that's something that we would like to do in the future, but, as with lots of other organizations, right, you're always a bit constrained by your funding and the size of your team. But in time, we hope to grow, to that point.
Mm-hmm. I definitely understand about the funding, limited resources. But I think, again, this goes back to systems thinking, right? Because a lot of this is just, we tend to focus so much on the subsystems, like how is the greenhouse going to work? How is this part going to work? But not the overall view. And I think in some senses, we can also learn a lot from systems engineering. Like when the European Space Agency has projects that they're planning, they have a concurrent design process. So essentially you have a specialized engineer from each part of the system, but then they all get together and actually talk about it and see, oh, well, this part might work, but then it's going to cause another problem here. And it's one of those things, I think, systems thinking, it's easy to say that we should do it, but it's very hard to actually implement. Because like you were saying, there's a point where it's too many stakeholders. And figuring out when each person needs to be involved in the process, I think is going to be really important, especially if we're thinking about space habitation, because it seems long term, but it's starting now.
Yeah, exactly. And, and I think this is the, this is the interesting thing is that as I've started to, try to frankly carve out this niche of space urban planning and trying to find a home for it, right? Is it something that exists outside of academia within, there's not really anywhere you can go to get a specific space urban planning degree. But that being said, it's like, I think the more that we can kind of do for space urban planning, what we did for space architecture, which is to really build it out as its own unique field within the space industry, that is what I really hope to see. But that takes a lot of resources, it takes a lot of funding, and people that are buying into the idea of why this is important. And so I hope that we'll get there over time. But yeah, I mean, of course, for right now, I mean, when we're talking about these big projects or these big efforts, we need more partners, we need more resources to order, in order to make those things happen.
Mhm.
But you got to start somewhere. So
Yeah, I definitely agree. So we do have a few more minutes left. If anyone else has any question they'd like to pop into the chat. Um, Otherwise, we can talk about analogs a bit more. I am definitely interested in that topic. I think, sorry, there's the, okay, someone just says they really enjoyed your presentation. So, yeah, so from in the sense of when you're talking about analogs, I am curious what you would say is where we've been lacking in terms of the urban planning, because typically analogs are very small, right? So there isn't that much in terms of, thinking about the infrastructure and how you're going to set up different parts of the base. But as we move forward with our exploration, that is kind of the obvious way forward. So what would you say if you were to start this project with urban planning on analog missions, where do you think we really need to focus our efforts initially?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and probably could be a conversation just in and of itself, kind of outside of this too, because I know we're going to run out of time here in a minute. But what I would say kind of more broadly is, basically we are very interested in kind of how things scale. So if you're absolutely right, like if some of these missions are, a crew of 4, crew of 5, what have you, there are lessons and things that we can learn in terms of crew dynamics and human factors that then we can start to apply to kind of like maybe a slightly bigger model, right? And then kind of seeing how that builds out, and kind of just how we can, a lot of those ideas on that last page there, how we can start to think about integrating those, and really it's about community building. And so, that's something, we love our virtual celestial citizen community. It's amazing. And it kind of spans podcast, newsletter, social media, lots of different places. And so I feel like what we are excited to do is actually start to bring some of those community aspects into like more of a physical element, as well, of design. So I know I'm going to run out of time here, and I don't want to keep anybody from the next session, but that's like a great conversation. I would love to have a follow-up conversation on that topic.
Yeah, we'll definitely we'll have a much longer conversation. It's a lot to dive into. But thank you so much, Britt. It was really an interesting presentation, great discussion afterwards, and thanks everyone for the questions. We do have 15 minutes before the next talk, so feel free to grab a coffee and walk around for a bit, and then we'll see you back here 45 past the hour. And thanks
Thank
again.
you so much, Saba. I appreciate you moderating, and thanks everyone for listening. I appreciate that too.